Good evening. Evidence that the police were warned 2 years ago that one of the men suspected of the July the 21st attacks was considered a dangerous threat by moderate Muslims, but little action seems to have been taken. All this as the Prime Minister proposes a battery of new powers to combat extremists. The Human Rights Act, websites, mosques, imams, possibly even George Galloway are all under scrutiny.
Let no one be in any doubt, the rules of the game are changing.
Tony Blair wants to shut down this man's organisation and possibly deport him. He tells us he wouldn't inform the police even if he knew people were planning to plant bombs next week. And away from all this, for the first time on TV, the subversive artist Bansky dodges Israeli soldiers to turn their security wall into his latest canvas.
And the other headlines tonight, it's a race against time for the Russian military as Britain joins the effort to rescue sailors trapped on a stranded submarine with less than 24 hours of air left. Police charged 20-year-old Paul Taylor and Michael Barton, who's 17, with the murder of the black teenager Anthony Walker. And yes, it really is true. England are on top against Australia in the second Ashes Test.
Well, now, one of the men accused of the attempted London tube bombings was named as an extremist troublemaker and reported to the Metropolitan Police 2 years ago, Channel 4 News can reveal tonight. Hussein Osman, who's currently being held in Italy on charges of international terrorism, was accused of inciting racial and religious hatred amongst moderate Muslims. That complaint was made in July 2003 by a South London mosque, but the police told them their hands were tied. This on the day that Tony Blair outlined sweeping new proposals to tackle extremism. Those who meddle in it, he said, have no place here. More on those measures in a moment, but first, Darshna Soni reports on the frustrated efforts to bring Hussein Osman to the attention of the authorities.
He sits in an Italian prison whilst the British authorities argue over his extradition. He's admitted involvement in the failed London bomb attacks. Hamdi Isaac, also known as Hussein Osman, claims that he never meant to kill. But Channel 4 News has uncovered documents that show he was part of an extreme, radical group who for 2 years tried to take over a South London mosque. His behaviour so alarming that it was brought to the attention of the authorities, but they did little to address the mosque's concerns.
Police's response was, and still is, that their hands are tied. I'm afraid somehow those people were out there for a long time and a number of them is still out there.
The story began at the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London. It has a notorious history. In the 1990s, it was a known gathering place for dozens of radical fanatics. After repeated warnings from the Muslim community, the mosque was finally closed following a police raid. But what happened to some of its radical worshippers? Detectives are now investigating whether any of the 8 suspected London bombers had links here. We have discovered that at least one of them did.
When the Finsbury Park Mosque closed, a large number of radicals were suddenly left with no base. We now know that a large number of them came here to South London.
Amongst the group, a man known as Hamdi Isaac, who later changed his name to Hussein Osman in order to claim asylum. Friday prayers in Stockwell, today a thriving mosque which attracts a multi-ethnic congregation. But 2 years ago, it came dangerously close to being taken over by Isaac and his group. They came here nearly every single day and tried to impose their own version of Islam upon the congregation. One man, too scared to show his face, describes what happened.
First, he tried to, brainwash the local attendees that, that the trustee and the management committee, they wasn't following Islamic teachings and they wasn't going according to the Islamic law, and they were sinners. We would just have his little circles and just talk about jihad, and we just constantly talk about Afghanistan and how the Bravo, we were just inciting people.
Hamdi Isaac's behaviour became increasingly alarming. At least 2 men were physically attacked. In another incident, the group graffitied the walls of the mosque with verses from the Quran. Translated, it means, "Those who fight in the path of Allah kill and get killed. This is the true promise of God Almighty." The mosque's trustees were so disturbed that they went to the police. On 24th of July 2003, they wrote a letter to the Deputy Borough Commander at Brixton. The letter accuses Hamdi Isaac and his associates of inciting racial and religious hatred, spreading extremist views, and harassing, intimidating, physically abusing and threatening the management of the mosque. The letter makes it explicit. They have an agenda to turn this centre into another Finsbury Park. Attached to the letter, a diary kept by a trustee of incidents of threats and intimidation. On July 1st, for example, police were called after threats from Hamdi Isaac and another man known as Habib. Then, in a bizarre twist, those accused wrote back to the mosque demanding Mr Qureshi's suspension. The letter was signed, among others, by Osman B. Hussein, Hamdi Isaac's other name.
What we could see was that there was an influx of people, new faces coming to our centres, and certain individuals, they raised the alarm that these people are from Finsbury Park Mosque, and they have been very violent.
An official complaint was also lodged at Kennington Police Station. The trustees claim their concerns weren't taken seriously enough, although some weeks later officers did help them install CCTV cameras.
The assessment of the level of threat was not correct, in my opinion. And secondly, the legislation has prevented police to take any action who incite religious hatred.
After a bitter period, the trustees eventually managed to expel Hamdi Isaac and his associates. Then, directly after the failed bomb attacks in London 2 weeks ago, the trustees were asked by detectives to identify a photograph of Hamdi Isaac. He was later arrested in Rome.
Even till this day, I still can't believe that it was Hamdi, the person who, for 2 years, we nearly saw him every day, like I said, at least 5 times a day, and it was such a big problem which he caused in our mosque. I mean, it's a problem that most of the trustees will never forget.
The Stockwell Mosque feels it had a lucky escape. It now runs a diversionary programme for vulnerable youngsters, providing free activities such as computer classes. It believes others should learn from its example. The government has announced extended powers to deal with extremists, but for those here at Stockwell, it's already too late. Although we know what eventually happened to Hamdi Isaac, we don't know what happened to those others in his group who tried to help him take over the mosque.
Darshana Soni there, and the Metropolitan Police have just given us the following statement. Police in Lambeth maintain a regular close liaison with representatives of each of the mosques in the borough of Lambeth. If and when concerns are expressed, action is taken to address those concerns. We consider any correspondence we have to be confidential, and we would not discuss those matters. Well now, an attempt today to counter accusations that Britain's a sanctuary for Muslim extremists. Tony Blair insisted, let no one be in any doubt, the rules of the game are changing. The Prime Minister outlined a 10-point plan to tackle the threat, including greater deportation powers to exclude foreign nationals who preach violence or hatred, amending Europe's Human Rights Act if necessary, a ban on glorifying or condoning terrorism, and closing down mosques and websites which foment it. Our correspondent Victoria MacDonald reports.
Last month's attacks on London changed everything, according to the Prime Minister, and today he was gambling that the public mood was ready for wide-ranging changes to terror legislation.
Let no one be in any doubt, the rules of the game are changing.
Time and again, the Prime Minister emphasised that the changes, some of them legislative, were aimed only at weeding out the extremists, not at the law-abiding.
To be frank, what has changed in the past 4 weeks since the attacks on the 7th of July is that people now understand that when we warn of the terrorist threat, this is not scaremongering, it's real.
The proposed changes include new grounds for deportation or exclusion, including fostering hatred, advocating violence to further a person's belief, or justifying or validating such violence. A list will be drawn up of extremist websites, bookshops and centres. Involvement with any of these could trigger deportation. And the government is prepared to amend the Human Rights Act if the courts stand in the way. Current legislation has made it almost impossible to deport militants such as Jordanian Abu Qatada, once described in court as the head of the Al-Qaeda organisation in Europe, or the radical cleric Omar Bakri, originally from Syria. It contravenes Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights and our Human Rights Act if they risk torture in their home country. But the government believes that, like France and Spain, it can get around this by seeking assurances from about 10 countries, including Algeria and Jordan, that this won't happen.
we know that there are countries, and I would give Saudi Arabia as an instance, where there are constant denials that torture takes place, yet there is overwhelming evidence that torture is widespread. So the mere fact that an agreement may be reached doesn't necessarily guarantee that the deportee will not be tortured.
The government will also consult on new powers to close places of worship believed to be fomenting extremism. New legislation will make it an offence to condone or glorify terrorism, not just in the UK, but anywhere in the world. And anyone who has participated in terrorism will be automatically refused asylum. For British nationals who can't be deported, control orders will be extended, including imprisonment. And they will look at extending how long terror suspects can be held without being charged. It's currently 14 days. The police want 3 months. Some of the changes will be easier to get through than others. The Prime Minister, for instance, wouldn't be drawn today on whether condoning or glorifying terrorism would apply to someone like the Respect MP George Galloway, who said today that Tony Blair had more blood on his hands than the London bombers.
Look, I'm not going to enter into a shouting match with that particular person, because I'm sure that's what he wants, and I don't think I should give it to him.
Which didn't answer the question, but did raise the difficulty of the proposed legislation. There was disquiet too at proposals to ban the radical Muslim group Hizb ut-Tahrir and the successor organisation of Al-Mujahirun, with concerns that this will merely drive them underground.
When a party which has a 50-year track record of Islamic political work, which is non-violent and which has condemned both 9/11 and the attacks on the 7th of July, can be banned, then I think that will reaffirm for Muslims really that this legislation is not really just about security, but is actually aimed at silencing Islamic political debate.
And at the reopened Finsbury Park Mosque, there was little sign of the backing the Prime Minister claims to have from Muslims for these changes.
Since the atrocity till now, the attack on Muslims increased in 600 times, in the mosque and the people themselves, and this might increase the situation a little bit more as well.
If the legislation can be drawn up in time, the government is prepared to recall Parliament a month early in September, but that will require cross-party support. And while the Conservatives signalled a broad welcome for the changes, the Liberal Democrats are frankly furious, saying they were not properly consulted.
Well, now, earlier I talked to the Home Office Minister, Hazel Blears. She was unable to comment about tonight's revelation that the police were warned about the alleged Shepherd's Bush bomber Hussein Osman 2 years ago for fear of prejudicing that investigation. On today's announcements by the Prime Minister, I asked her why it would now be legal to deport extremists to countries believed to practice torture.
Well, in other European countries who are subject to exactly the same human rights legislation as we are, they've been able to deport people to other countries on the basis of assurances that they've been given. That's why we want to enter into agreements with a range of countries to give us these assurances, and then we think it's right and proper that our decisions to deport or exclude should be upheld by the courts, and we're willing to test that.
And how do you monitor that?
We want to make sure that there are provisions in place to ensure that we can monitor it as well, and that's the kind of agreement we'll be entering into. And if we can get those agreements, then we think that we should be able to deport people from our country who at the moment are stirring up terrorism, drawing our young people into this kind of extremism, because it's not something that should happen in our country.
When George Galloway says things like there's far more blood on the hands of Tony Blair than there ever was on the people who laid the bombs on the tube in London, can the likes of George Galloway and, dare one say it, Muslim people in Britain go on saying things like that if these laws come into practice?
Well, I think the public will make their own mind up about George Galloway. No,
it's a legal issue.
Well, what we're determined to do with the criteria that we've set out today for consultation, because these are delicate and sensitive issues, but what we're determined to make happen is that people cannot be in this country who are foreign nationals and set about stirring up hatred, glorifying terrorism and drawing our young people into extremism. That simply is not the way that we conduct our affairs in the UK.
Right, but British nationals, like indeed the people who blew themselves up on the tube, can go on doing that till the cows come home.
No, not at all. From the autumn, we'll have legislation that has new criminal offences around glorifying terrorism, around indirect incitement, so we should be able to prosecute more people. We also want to look at control orders to
Which,
see...
well, I'll leave controls for a second, but that again brings us back to George Galloway. I mean, can George Galloway and the likes of him go on saying those things or not?
Well, if people are glorifying and justifying terrorism or doing acts that amount to indirect incitement, once the new legislation is in place, it'll be a matter for the courts to consider their behaviour and to see whether or not those offences are fulfilled.
So when George Galloway says what he says this morning, was that or was that not incitement?
Well, I'm not a court and I'm not considering a criminal offence.
Well, come on, you're a politician who's behind all this. It's your job to make this happen. Was that or was that not incitement?
The criminal offence does not even exist yet. We're consulting on that. We'll be drawing it up for legislation.
You simply must have an opinion on this. Was that or was that not incitement?
Well, as I say to you, I am not the judge, I am not the court, and we're talking about...
I'm not suggesting you are. I'm suggesting you're the politician whose job it is to implement this, as Tony Blair said this morning, and you must have an opinion on that.
And what I'm absolutely determined to make happen is that people will not be inciting, fomenting hatred and terrorism in this country. If they are foreign nationals doing it, then they will be excluded, and if they're British citizens doing it, then they will be prosecuted under our new legislation.
Hazel Blears, and a little later we'll be hearing what one radical cleric thinks about the proposals. But first, they're stranded on the seabed with apparently less than 24 hours worth of air left. With the details, here's Sarah.
Thanks, Alex. Time is running out. Some reports suggest there is only enough air for till 11 o'clock tomorrow morning for the 7 men who are trapped underwater in a submarine. In a grim reminder of the Russian Kursk disaster 5 years ago, where all 118 people on board perished, this smaller sub got into trouble just off the Kamchatka Peninsula yesterday, when a fishing net got tangled in its propeller. The Royal Navy is now sending a team to help with the rescue operation.
The AS-28 or Priz class are the Russian Navy's rescue subs. Small and manoeuvrable, they're designed to dive to 1,000 metres and evacuate personnel trapped in the Navy's larger submarines. The mini-sub was taking part in a naval exercise and ran into trouble early yesterday. 10 Russian ships are in the area, but first thing this morning, they requested international assistance in staging a submarine rescue. Now it's a question of time.
Now, as I promised, we have made appropriate calculations, checked all information. There is air remaining on the underwater apparatus for a day, 1 day.
The 13-metre-long sub normally has a crew of just 3. It's close to the sea floor in 190 metres of water, too deep for the crew to evacuate or for divers to get to them. According to the Russian Navy, it ran into trouble when its propeller got snagged on a fragment of fishing net. The sub then got tangled in cable attached to the net. The plan that seems to be emerging is to send down a remotely operated submarine to cut the cable and free the stricken sub. Tonight, the Royal Navy is dispatching its Scorpio submersible to assist with the rescue.
It is all against time, nothing else. We've been told it's an 11-hour flight, and once we get there, maybe take 2 to 3 hours to do our welding, to do the wiring and set the system up. Most of that, hopefully we should be able to do underway on the ship itself.
The US Navy have sent 2 similar vehicles. All are equipped with robotic arms and cable cutters that should be able to disentangle the sub. The scramble to rescue the 7 submariners is painfully reminiscent of the Kursk tragedy almost exactly 5 years ago. 118 Russian servicemen drowned following an explosion beneath the Barents Sea. The crew of the Priz are unhurt and have been told to conserve power till help arrives, but the British team don't expect to be at the scene for another 20 hours, leaving little time to get to the crew if their air is to run out tomorrow. Tonight, though, another Russian naval official suggested the 7 have sufficient air to last over the weekend.
2 men have appeared in court today charged with the murder of Anthony Walker. The teenager was killed after being struck with an axe a week ago. Anthony's family were in court when 20-year-old Paul Taylor and 17-year-old Michael Barton appeared before magistrates in Huyton on Merseyside. And this evening, the local community is gathering for a church service, which will be followed by a candlelit procession at McGoldrick Park, where Anthony Walker was found dead. A 20-year-old man was arrested today by officers investigating the murder of another man in a knife attack on a bus in North London. 28-year-old Richard Whelan was stabbed several times last Friday after he tried to stop a man throwing chips at his girlfriend. The man was arrested in Surrey this morning and taken to a London police station where he remains in custody. Britain has called on Iran to free the hunger-striking journalist Akbar Ganji, who's now not eaten for 55 days and is believed to be close to death. We reported on the plight of Iran's most famous political prisoner on Channel 4 News last night. And today, the British Embassy in Tehran called for the urgent release of the prisoner of conscience. He was imprisoned in 2001 for naming senior officials he said were involved in murdering political dissidents. Cricket now, and it is looking promising for England in the second Ashes test at Edgbaston. England struck early. Aussie opener Justin Langer took this blow to the head from paceman Steve Harmanson. But he survived to see his partner Matthew Hayden caught out for a duck off the ball of Matthew Hoggart. Simon Jones captured the prized wicket of Justin Langer, out for 82. And a questionable LBW decision saw off Jason Gillespie. But minutes later, Andrew Flintoff struck again, and Australia were all out for 308. England went back into bat, but only managed 25 before spin bowler Shane Warne dismissed Andrew Strauss with this extraordinary ball. Australia trail England by 124, and you can catch the highlights on Channel 4 at 12:45 tonight. A look at the markets now, and early gains made by the FTSE were eroded by a wave of profit-taking at the close. The index of 100 leading shares was down slightly. A short time ago, the pound was down against the dollar by just over 2/3 of a cent, and sterling was up against the euro by just under 1/5 of a cent. Now, to mark tomorrow's 60th anniversary of the world's first atomic attack, a concert has been performed on a piano that survived the bombing of Hiroshima. Barring the scars of the attack, the outfall, it remained intact 3 kilometres from the epicentre of the blast. The owner, who was a young girl, died a day after the Enola Gay dropped its devastating load. Her mother shut the piano's lid, and until now the instrument had not been played.
Tonight's main news. Channel 4 News has discovered that the Metropolitan Police were warned 2 years ago that the would-be London tube bomber Hussein Osman was part of a group of radical Islamic extremists inciting hatred amongst moderate Muslims. And the Prime Minister has announced sweeping new powers to tackle the threat of terrorism, insisting proponents of extremist violence have no place in Britain.
But I'm sorry, people can't come here and abuse our good nature and our tolerance. They can't come here and start inciting our young people in communities to take up violence against British people here. And if they do that, they're going to go back.
Well, now, earlier this afternoon, I talked to Omar Bakri Mohammed, the London-based Syrian preacher and the founder of the radical Muslim group Al-Muhajirun, which Tony Blair says would be banned. I asked him if he thought he was a restraining influence on young Muslims preparing to bomb London's transport system.
I believe I was able to do so for the last 20 years. I hold back all the Muslims, youth who was angry about issue of Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir for the last 20 years. And God knows how much pressure I was myself facing from controlling the youth. It's not easy to control youth, especially if they are Muslims, so proud about their own religion.
If you knew that another attack was being planned, would you tell the police?
You see, I never believe in the first place that is if anything going to happen in the UK that I will be quiet. I said publicly in the record, if I know somebody going to attack here, I will hold him. I will call the Muslims to hold him.
Would you tell the police?
No, I will never tell the police.
Right, so if a bunch of people who you knew were going to plant a bomb on a train in London next week, you would not tell the police?
You see, I always said, I'm not working for the police. The police should himself.
Yeah, it's a yes or no question. The answer is you would not tell the police.
I will never ever tell the police about any Muslims. Islam forbid me. It's a matter of religious obligation.
Okay.
You see.
Okay.
So
now the other point I want to talk about is you say leaving that issue to one side. Equally, you say that whilst you do not think it's an Islamic thing to do to attack people in this country with whom you work, you trade, with whom you live, it is not just okay but desirable and a very good thing to attack, for instance, British soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, for the Muslims there, they have the duty to fight occupiers, whether they are British soldiers or American soldiers. I say that, you see, the way George Galloway said, because he is not a Muslim, is allowed to say it. Omar, if he said, going to arrest him, that is where you have a problem yourself with the Muslims who are stand to what he believes. I believe Muslims in the UK, they are under the siege now, and the new law of terrorism, and this new law, I think it will make life difficult if it's backdated. If it's not backdated, I think will be everything harmony. Even if they deport me, I think people will see it as a new form of agreement, new form of contract. Accept it or leave.
Omar Bakri Mohammed speaking to me a little earlier. When we come back, from graffiti artist to war artist, as Banksy's creations adorn Israel's security fence around the West Bank, more than just another pick on the wall?